viewers, in the last session we enjoyed the story of Mill on the Floss written by George Eliot. In this session, let us look at different literary devices used by George Eliot in order to make her novel interesting. Before that, we also tried to gather some information relating to her childhood and her contribution to the world of literature. George Eliot was the male pseudonym of Mary Ann Evans, and she was born on November 22nd, 1819 at Arbury Farm in Warwickshire. Her father, Robert Evans, was an overseer at the Arbury Hall estate. The Mill on the Floss involves many autobiographical details, and it reflects Eliot's close childhood relationships with her father and her older brother Isaac. Eliot was sent to school as a child and at the age of 15 and underwent a spiritual conversion to evangelicism similar to Maggie Tulliver's pious conversion upon reading Thomas à Kempis in Book 4 of The Mill on the Floss. In 1841, Eliot and her father moved closer to the town of Coventry, which was at that time a centre of radical thought. Eliot moved to London after her father's death. In London, Eliot became the assistant editor of John Chapman's Westminster Review, and in 1852, Eliot met George Henry Lewes, a writer and an editor of The Leader. The relationship was scandalized in London because of Lewes' first wife. Eliot sacrificed her relationship with her brother Isaac, and she depicted the pain of his disapproval in The Mill on the Floss in Tom's disapproval of Maggie's relationships with Philip and Stephen. Eliot and Lewes lived together, considering themselves virtually married, until his death in 1878. By the time of the publication of The Mill on the Floss in 3 volumes in 1860, Mary Ann Evans' authorship had been tentatively guessed by a few London intellectuals and friends. Already she was climbing the popularity chart in the world of literature. The Mill on the Floss marks a break from the earlier work of Eliot, which was mainly a depiction of provincial life, and it bridged the gap to more wide-ranging later novels such as Middlemarch that drew detailed backdrops of the social and economic forces alive in an entire community. The Mill on the Floss is Eliot's only novel to end tragically and the most autobiographical novel. Tom and Maggie are the 2 kids growing up at Dodlecote Mill, which is an inherent part of their family for generations. They have an extended family living nearby and is the root cause that makes the life of Tullivers complex and turbulent. Of the 2 kids, Maggie is both smart and troublesome. Tullivers are troubled by 2 things in life. What are they? They are school and a lawsuit. The education system makes Tom useless and fancy, and the lawsuit affects Tulliver's health and wealth. Mr. Wakeham buys the Tulliver family mill, which causes Mr. Tulliver to hate the Wakehams even more and to curse them in the family Bible. After the lawsuit fiasco, the Tulliver kids are forced to leave school and start working. The family debts force to slave away for one of his uncles, and Maggie finds comfort in religion, 2 different interests. She also falls in love with Philip Wakeham and suffers from emotional stress. Tom discovers the secret and stops her from seeing Philip. Maggie is torn between her love and her brother Tom. Tom finally clears the family debt, and Mr. Tulliver does not live long to enjoy his debt-free life. He attacks Mr. Wakeham and dies. The Tullivers move away from the mill. Tom is successful now. Few years go by and Maggie returns from a stint as a governess to stay with her cousin Lucy. But Maggie's life is messed up as she falls in love with her cousin Lucy's handsome suitor Stephen Guest. Philip also returns and Maggie is embroiled in a messy love quadrangle. Somehow, she reconciles but continues to remain judgmental. The local river is in floods. Despite the differences, Maggie tries to save the drowning Tom. Eventually, both of them meet the tragic end, whereas the other characters all survive and move on with their lives, and Tom and Maggie are buried together. A tragic end to the story. Maggie Tulliver is the impetuous, clever, younger daughter of the Tullivers of Dorlcote Mill. Maggie frustrates her naive mother with her weird taste of fashion and wild intelligence. Mr. Tulliver is supportive of his daughter, but Maggie finds emotional support in her brother Tom, who is unfortunately always critical of her and her lifestyle. Though Tom is less studious than Maggie appears to be, Mr. Tulliver decides to educate his son further, and this becomes the reason for the family to quarrel. Dodsons and Mrs. Glegg, Mrs. Tulliver's sisters, also dislike the idea of educating Tom, who, quite against their wish, paid for Tom's education. Mr. Tulliver somehow repays the debt. But affectionate Tulliver does not ask Glegg and her husband Moses to pay him back the money he gave them. Here, the element of humanity surfaces in Mr. Tulliver. Tom is tutored by Mr. Stelling, a clergyman, and Maggie frequents to school to visit Tom and eventually falls in love with crippled Philip Wakeham, son of her father's enemy. Tom is forced to return home to support the family because of the financial woes of family and Mr. Tulliver's health. The mill itself is up for auction, and lawyer Wakeham, based on an idea inadvertently furnished by Mrs. Tulliver, buys Dorlcote Mill and retains Mr. Tulliver as a manager in an act of humiliating patronage. The gloomy atmosphere continues even after Mr. Tulliver's recovery. But return of Bob Jackin, a childhood friend of Tom's, brings some brightness in the family. Bob introduces Maggie to a book. The name of the book is Thomas A Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. The element of spirituality gets activated in her and it leads to self-denial. Maggie comes out of this spiritual trance after she falls in love with Philip Wakeham. Tom discovers their meetings, cruelly upbraids Philip, and makes Maggie swear not to see Philip again. Tom is now successful and clears the family debts. But Mr. Tulliver, in a fit of rage, attacks lawyer Wakeham, falls ill and dies. Several years later, Maggie has been teaching in another village. She returns to St. Ogg's as a tall, striking woman and visits her cousin Lucy. She falls in love with her rich suitor, Stephen Guest, but the relationship becomes messy when Philip also returns. Maggie and Philip renew their friendship again and also express their desire to marry each other. Maggie also pushes Philip to take permission from his father and sell the mill to Tom. Lawyer Wakeham is eventually responsive to both propositions. However, Stephen and Maggie have gradually become helplessly attracted to each other against both of their expectations and wishes. But Maggie wriggles out of the fatal attraction by taking another teaching post away from St. Aug's. Stephen pursues her and Philip becomes jealous. Because of the muddle the three were in, Maggie is considered as a fallen woman and a social outcast. When she returns to St. Aug's, Tom also renounces her. Maggie is befriended only by the Jackins and the clergyman Dr. Ken. Lucy secretly visits Maggie to show her forgiveness. Philip as well sends a letter of forgiveness and faithfulness. Stephen sends Maggie a letter renewing his pleas for her hand in marriage and protesting the pain she has caused him. Maggie vows to bear the burden of the pain she has caused others and must endure herself until death, but wonders to herself how long this trial her life will be. At this moment, water begins rushing under the Jackins' door from the nearby river Floss, which is flooding. Maggie wakes the Jackins and takes one of their boats, rowing it down the river in a feat of miraculous strength toward Dorlcote Mill. Maggie rescues Tom, who is trapped in the house, and they row down the river towards Lucy. Before they can reach Lucy's house, the boat is capsized by debris in the river and Maggie and Tom drown in each other's arms. So sad. The love for them suddenly has become intense but meets a tragic end. Years go by and Philip and Stephen and Lucy stay together and visit the grave frequently. The first character and the protagonist of the novel is Maggie Tulliver. The novel begins with the introduction of Maggie as an impulsive and intelligent girl. Eliot presents her as an imaginative and interesting than the rest of her family and is badly in need of love and affection. Maggie's clandestine affairs and other preoccupation create disharmony among the family members. Maggie is emotionally attached to Tom, but the latter is always critical of her, and this throws Maggie into the utter despair particular to immaturity of Tom. Maggie's exposure to a book called Book of Thomas à Kempis' Writings as a child leads to spiritual awakening and self-denial. Two important elements dominate this novel. One is spiritual awakening in Maggie and her self-denial. Maggie paradoxically practices her humility with natural passion and pride. It is not until she re-establishes a friendship with Philip Wakeham and Maggie feels the conflict of the full intellectual life that Philip offers her and her duty to her father. It is Tom who reminds her of this duty, and Maggie's wish to be approved by Tom remains strong. The final books of The Mill on the Floss feature Maggie at the age of 19. She looks beautiful and sensuous. Maggie has been often unhappy in her young adulthood. Having given up her early asceticism, she longs for a richness of life that is unavailable to her. Stephen, Lucy's handsome suitor, plays into Maggie's romantic expectations of life and gratifies her pride. Maggie is torn between Philip's love and Stephen's fatal attraction. She also displays her unconditional love for Tom by trying to save him while the local river was in floods. Second important character of this novel is Tom Tulliver. He is introduced as a less intelligent child when compared to Maggie. He is more practical and the bookish educational system does not suit him. Though critical, Tom is very close to Maggie. He responds almost instinctively to her affection and they are likened to two animals. Tom has a strong self-righteous sense of fairness and justice, which often figures into his decisions and relationships more than tenderness. He proves to be responsible by clearing the family debts and becoming a capitalist entrepreneur. Tom's character seems capable of love and kindness. He buys a puppy for Lucy Dean and he often ends up reconciling with Maggie. But the difficult circumstances of his young life have led him into a bitter single-mindedness reminiscent of his father. Another dominating character of this novel is Mr. Tulliver. He is the victim of both his own character and the circumstances of his life. His personal pride acts as a villain in his life and makes him bankrupt. Despite being a queer character, he exhibits a kind of method in madness. Mr. Tulliver is somewhat more intelligent than his wife, a point of pride and planning for him. Yet, he is still puzzled. Look at the contrast by the expanding economic world, as well as the complexities of language. Part of the tragedy of Tulliver's downfall is the tragedy of the loss of his way of life. Mr. Tulliver is one of the few models of unconditional love in the novel. His affection for Maggie and his sister Mrs. Moss, and these are the few narrative bright spots of the first few chapters. He also comes across as a stubborn, obsessive and narrow-minded person. These traits make him hollow from within and kill him. The most intelligent character of all in this novel is Philip Wakem. Philip Wakem is perhaps the most intelligent and insightful character of The Mill on the Floss. He is the only character who appreciates the intelligent side of Maggie. He is well read, cultured and accomplished sketcher. A hunch on his back, which is a deformity, has made him bitter and melancholic. Like Maggie, he also suffers from lack of love and is attracted to Maggie because of her capacity to love someone unconditionally. Very important, unconditional love, without expecting anything from the person you love. Philip's gentleness, small stature and sensitivity of feelings cause people to describe him as womanly, and he is implicitly not considered as a passionate attachment for Maggie. The first dominating imagery is music. We often see Maggie transporting herself to the other world while listening to music. She is so overcome with emotion and forgetful of any punitive or self-denying impulses. As a motive, music works the opposite way too. When Maggie experiences moments of profound unconscious discovery or understanding, these moments are accompanied by a sense of music, as when she reads Thomas à Kempis for the first time and feels as though she hears a strain of solemn music. The vulnerability that Maggie experiences in relation to music can also put her in danger. Stephen Guest woos Maggie with music and not with words. and we see that his singing creates an emotion that seemed to make her at once strong and also weak. Strong for all enjoyment, weak for all resistance. How interesting. The observation is really interesting. Music in The Mill on the Floss is not meant to indicate moments when Maggie is either succumbing to evil or experiencing good, but rather it indicates her generally heightened sensibilities. Maggie seems to experience everything with more emotion than others, and music is used throughout the novel to underscore this effect. Well, animals also find place in this novel, used as an interesting imagery. Especially in the early books of The Mill on the Floss, Tom and Maggie are associated with animal imagery. The imagery is usually of farm type animals, ponies, dogs, ducks, and usually points to the character's capacity for affection or non-adherence to social convention. Very imaginative and creative. Following Darwin, Eliot uses this imagery also to gesture towards the wider relation between humans and animals that can be especially seen in young children. When Maggie and Tom reconcile, the narrator points out, we adults no longer approximate in our behavior to the mere impulsiveness of the lower animals, but conduct ourselves in every respect like members of a highly civilized society. Maggie and Tom were still very much like young animals. How beautiful the imagination is. The writer also uses different symbols, or in other words, symbolism is quite rich. The symbols are the Floss, the river which is in floods, and it is a difficult symbol to track as it also exists for realistic effect in the workings of the novel. On the symbolic level, the Floss is related most often to Maggie, and the river with its depth and potential to flood symbolizes Maggie's deeply running and unpredictable emotions. The river's path, non-existent on maps, is also used to symbolize the unforeseeable path of Maggie's destiny. Well, another important symbol is Saint Og. Saint Og was a legendary patron saint of the town and was a ferryman. One night, a woman with a child asked to be taken across the river, but the winds were high and no other boaters would take her. Only Og felt pity for her in her need and took her. When they reached the other side, her rags turned into robes and she revealed herself to be the Blessed Virgin. The Virgin pronounced Og's boat safe to all who rode in it, and she sat always in the prow. The parable of Saint Og rewards the human feeling of pity or sympathy. Maggie has a dream during her night on the boat with Stephen, wherein Tom and Lucy row past them, and Tom is Saint Og, while Lucy is the Virgin. The dream makes explicit Maggie's fear of having neglected to sympathize with those whom she hurts during her night with Stephen. But it is Maggie finally who stands for Saint Og, and she rows down river thinking only of Tom's safety during the flood in a feat of, writer here describes this feat as almost miraculous, divinely protected effort. The final chapters of the novel conclude with several interesting elements. Lucy's visit, along with Philip and Stephen's letters, provide a somewhat constructed means by which Maggie has interviews with all the characters close to her and is forgiven before her death. Yet, the total effect of these final interviews is not one of tranquility. Tranquility here is inner peace or peace within. Philip's and Lucy's words bring Maggie happiness and also added grief over the inherent goodness of the very people she has betrayed. Stephen's letter arrives as another trial. Even after her reconciliation with Lucy and Philip, Maggie feels the temptation of the life that Stephen offers. The effect of the letter on her is shown in the face that she hears the letter rather than reads it. Much in the same way she heard a voice speaking the text of that interesting book called Thomas à Kempis rather than reading it silently. The ending scenes and especially the flood of the mill on the Floss have been criticized for their unrealistic quality. Maggie's plea to know how much longer her painful life will last is met almost supernaturally by the immediate onset of the flood. Yet, we know that George Eliot had planned on the flood from the beginning and meant for it to seem a realistic occurrence. Her first work on the novel consisted of research in London into the annual register for cases of flooding from earlier in the century. The flood, like Wakeham's purchase of the mill, provides a tragic circumstance in which the tragedy of Maggie's character becomes clear. The flood also provides the heightened atmosphere of danger and sense of the power of nature that is needed to properly put Maggie and Tom's differences into perspective. Maggie's heroic feat of strength and selflessness in her rescue of Tom reveals her true character to the stubborn, narrow-minded Tom. Tom has been insisting through the novel that Maggie recognize his right to care for her and dictate her actions, but in the end, Maggie who cares for both of them and shows herself capable. The depiction of Maggie's rescue of Tom recalls the story of St. Ogg's and evokes the trait of sympathy that lies at the heart of the St. Ogg's parable. Maggie's extreme capacity of feeling for the plight of others is what overcomes Tom's bitter sense of justice and reunites them. The end of The Mill on the Floss signifies a return to the beginning of the novel, to Maggie's nostalgia for their childhood days, when she and Tom were united. In the boat, Tom calls Maggie by her childhood name Maxie. They are drowned in each other's arms, and the final imagery of the scene directly evokes their childhood and reinterprets their time as idyllic, saying, "Brother and sister had gone down in an embrace never to be parted," living through again in one supreme moment the days when they had clasped their little hands in love and roamed the daisy fields together. This dramatized return to beginnings affirms Maggie's impulses to abandon Stephen and return to her origins, vindicating her at the same moment that she becomes a tragic hero. The postscript conclusion serves to place Maggie and Tom in the larger context of their landscape and society. The same flood that took their lives has left its mark on the countryside, implying that Maggie and Tom's deaths left a mark on the community. The conclusion also assures us that Stephen and Lucy have begun a new relationship and Philip remains faithful to Maggie's memory through a lifetime. It is 5 years later and all of the characters of the novel are still living except Tom and Maggie. Philip and Stephen visit Maggie's grave. Years later than this, Stephen and Lucy visit Maggie's grave together and Philip visits alone. Maggie and Tom's tomb reads, "In their death they were not divided." How beautiful the conclusion is. The conclusion teaches us many lessons. Hope you enjoyed this class and see you in the next class. Thank you.